You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Disney. What does it take to build a world people never want to leave? In Disney World Builders, Academy Award and Emmy-nominated filmmaker Leslie Iwerks takes audiences inside the creative journeys of some of Disney's most influential storytellers. Featuring exclusive interviews with James Cameron, Jon Favreau, Kevin Feige, and more, this new documentary reveals the imagination, innovation, and storytelling that continue to inspire generations and shape entertainment. Coming to Disney Plus on August 20th.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 538 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
With this episode, we're going to continue with the story of the Battle of Peachtree Creek, which took place outside Atlanta on July 20th, 1864. But before we get back to the battle, we wanted to drop in an announcement here at the start of this show, since we aren't certain everyone listens to the end of the episodes once the trumpet sounds. But anyway, we're going to be out of town the next few weeks, back in Pennsylvania for some R&R and to help my parents celebrate their 60th anniversary.
But rather than just leave y'all with dead air the next couple of weeks, we're going to re-release a few of our favorite past episodes for your listening pleasure. And we're recording short new introductions and conclusions to those shows.
So, we wanted to give you guys a heads up about that now, so you aren't wondering what on earth's going on with these old shows showing up on your feed. But hopefully they'll scratch your Civil War itch while we're gone. And there's also the entire back catalog of 530 some other past shows, as well as over 160 members episodes over on Patreon. In fact, just this past week, we released a dispatch for the senior officers of the Strawfoot Brigade, in which we take a closer look at John B. Hood's wounds, which he suffered at the battles of Gettysburg and Chickamauga.
We also released another video in which Rich asked who'd you rather put in command of your Civil War cavalry, John Buford or Jeb Stuart, which sparked a lively discussion on the podcast Facebook page.
Yeah. And then just yesterday, we released members episode 168 about John C. Fremont issuing his Emancipation Proclamation in Missouri 165 years ago this month, in August 1861. So, yeah, lots of good stuff for the folks in the Strawfoot Brigade.
So that's the announcement that we'll be heading out of town. We're looking forward to visiting with Rich's parents in Pennsylvania and helping them celebrate this big milestone. And while we're gone, we hope y'all enjoy listening to a few of our favorite past episodes.
As you guys will recall, with the last episode, we got the Battle of Peachtree Creek started, and according to Hood's planned and echelon east to west attack, the rightmost division of Hardee's Corps would be the first rebel formation to step off.
But that division, Bates, floundered about in the tangled terrain for 2 hours and never got into the fight.
Exactly, which meant that the Confederates, who were supposed to strike, crush, and turn the Army of the Cumberland's left flank, ended up missing it altogether.
The next rebel division that went in, Walker's, hit Newton's division from the Federals' Fourth Corps and was repulsed, which, as we said at the end of the last show, meant that the Union left would hold and not be rolled up as Hood had hoped.
You might remember that Newton had had a bad feeling about the situation after he'd crossed Peachtree Creek, and so he'd put his division to work starting to throw up earthworks. And those defenses had helped his men defeat the rebel attack on his position. However, other portions of the Army of the Cumberland's lines were less prepared to receive a Confederate attack, especially in the center, where the long east-west ridge running past Collier's Mill gradually lost elevation and dipped to a shallow valley around Tanyard Creek.
Next up in Hardee's Corps, in Hood's planned east-to-west attack, was the division of Brigadier General George Manny, which was still known as Cheatham's Division, after its former commander.
Manny would be charging forward toward the unsuspecting Federal left center. He commanded 4 brigades with perhaps 4,500 men in total, and every one of them was a Tennessean like their commander. George Manny was an experienced officer, leading a formidable collection of veterans into battle at Peachtree Creek, and he should have struck the hardest blow of Hardee's Corps, but instead his division crept forward and barely fought at all.
The Tennesseans stepped off just fine, but soon encountered a belt of thick woods to their front. Rather than plunging into the trees, they halted and sent out skirmishers to probe ahead, as the afternoon and the evening wore on and daylight faded.
No one really knows why Manny's division failed to press home its attack, since neither George Manny nor any of his 4 brigade commanders submitted after-action reports. But the contrast between their timid advance and the ferocious charges made by the Confederate formations to their right and left is striking. Hood would eventually blame Hardee, who, of course, was in overall command of his corps' attack, but whatever the reason, what should have been the strongest portion of the rebel assault ended up amounting to nothing.
If Manny's division flinched and failed to press its attack, no such failure could be attributed to the next rebel division to charge forward.
Moving forward against the Federal center were 2 brigades from Wing Loring's division, commanded by Winfield Scott Featherston and Thomas Scott. Their brigades fielded about 2,700 men from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana.
Featherston's and Scott's brigades pressed forward toward the low ridge up ahead, but found the going tough as they advanced through thick woods before breaking into an open field about 800 yards from the Union line.
The field itself was divided by the thorn-choked bed of Tanyard Creek. A major in a Mississippi regiment would recall how, quote, owing to the rough and broken ground, the ravines, the small streams with their overhanging and exuberant growth of vines and brambles, and fences covered with briars, so dense as to form an almost impenetrable jungle, it was found exceedingly difficult, and in fact impossible, to advance in good order.
Despite those difficulties, the 2 brigades surged forward. To their front, at the dead center of the Army of the Cumberland's lines, were the Federals from the 20th Corps Division, commanded by Brigadier General William Ward.
One Indiana soldier would call Ward, with ample cause, quote, the poorest excuse for a general I ever saw, end quote. But what had saved Ward in the past, and would save him again here at Peachtree Creek, was his capable, experienced subordinates, including 2 of his brigade commanders, both colonels, both Hoosiers, and both with something to prove.
Colonel John Coburn had suffered the indignity of having to surrender his command a year before, after being surrounded by Confederate cavalry led by Nathan Bedford Forrest at Thompson Station in Tennessee.
Eventually exchanged, Coburn was eager for the opportunity to redeem his reputation. Then Colonel and future 23rd U.S. President Benjamin Harrison had his own reputational battles to fight as he labored under the burden of his family name and heroic military and political lineage. You see, Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, and before that, the bane of the Indian chief Tecumseh and the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, leading to the catchy campaign slogan for Harrison and his running mate John Tyler in the 1840 presidential election, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Here, after the brigade had crossed Peachtree Creek on July 20th, Ward had halted his brigade in a cornfield short of the ridge line up ahead. However, both Newton to the left and Geary to the right had advanced their divisions to the high ground, but not Ward, who merely sent forward skirmishers.
Both Coburn and Harrison saw the need to advance to fill the gap ahead, to form a solid line on the high ground to their front with Newton and Geary. But when they expressed their concerns to Ward, he appeared content to ignore the potential peril.
Harrison, for his part, was not content to ignore the potential peril and had decided to pay no attention to Ward. He just issued orders to his regimental commanders to move forward when the rebel attack started and the Federal skirmishers came tumbling back.
Harrison promptly led the Hoosiers, Buckeyes, and Illinoisans of his brigade forward to the ridge ahead and blunted the rebel attack, along with Coburn and also Ward's 3rd Brigade, led by Colonel James Wood. Together, they plugged the gap between Newton to the east and Geary to the west, and repulsed the Confederate attack on the Union center. One eyewitness wrote, "The rebels were losing heavily and began to halt, waver, kink up, and finally break to the rear."
Harrison would report, "Our advance, though desperately resisted by the enemy, was steady and unfaltering. The fighting was hand to hand, and step by step the enemy was pushed back over the crest in our front, and the key point of the battle won."
And so the Confederate attack on the center was repulsed, and the rebel soldiers were torn mercilessly by shot and shell as they made their way back toward the cover of the woods and the safety of their own lines. One of the defenders recalled, quote, "As our adversaries hastened down the hill and through wide fields in the direction of Atlanta, volley after volley was poured after them, dotting the field with the dead and the dying."
This episode is brought to you by Disney. What does it take to build a world people never want to leave? In Disney World Builders, Academy Award and Emmy-nominated filmmaker Leslie Iwerks takes audiences inside the creative journeys of some of Disney's most influential storytellers. Featuring exclusive interviews with James Cameron, Jon Favreau, Kevin Feige, and more. This new documentary reveals the imagination, innovation, and storytelling that continue to inspire generations and shape entertainment. Coming to Disney Plus on August 20th.
Take your love for the game further with EA Sports Madden NFL 27. Powered by the all-new Persona engine, it's your league. Transform how you run your franchise. And with the Kickoff Bundle, you can start from the beginning with access to College Football 27 and Madden NFL 27 Standard Editions. From campus legend to NFL superstar, make your rise with the Kickoff Bundle. Learn more at EA.com. Rated E for everyone with mild lyrics, user interact, and in-game purchases includes random items.
Mazda has been named Consumer Reports' safest new car brand. It starts with our approach. Every Mazda comes standard with proactive safety features, so you're more aware of what's around you, more focused on the road ahead, and ready before problems ever start. Mazda, more of what matters most to you. Go to MazdaUSA.com to learn more. Consumer Reports does not endorse or promote any product.
Even as the Confederate attack faltered on the Army of the Cumberland's left and center, the fighting continued desperately on the Union right, as two brigades of rebels commanded by Daniel Reynolds and Edward O'Neill from Wathle's division in Stuart's corps drove north along and to the east of the Howell Mill Road to strike portions of two Federal divisions led by Alpheus Williams and John Geary.
Both Williams and Geary were experienced commanders, and their names may be most familiar to you guys from the Battle of Gettysburg. I don't know that we've ever mentioned that Geary was a veritable giant in those days, standing nearly 6 feet, 6 inches tall, and he later served 2 terms as governor of Pennsylvania. In any case, here on this end of the Federal line, the surprise of the Confederate attack was considerably lessened as the Yankee soldiers heard the sounds of battle start up to their left, to the east, then listened as the fighting rolled closer to them.
After being called upon to support Joseph Knipe's hard-pressed brigade, Corporal Edmund Brown and his comrades dashed about 70 yards across an open field to repel the attack by Reynolds' Confederate brigade against the Federal right. The 27th Indiana formed up along the edge of a gully near a jungle of trees and brush. The space was too cramped to allow everyone to form a line, so the soldiers in back handed their loaded muskets to the men in front, some of whom fired more than 100 rounds.
While we were lying in reserve with our brigade, not long after we had seen General Knipe's riderless horse and heard the report that the general had been killed, the general himself came hurrying back from the front. He was a mercurial, demonstrative little man always, but now he was wrought up more than common. He was frantic.
Without appearing to address himself to anyone in particular, he inquired for General Williams and added that he wanted a regiment to support his right flank. His line was in danger of being turned, and his own 46th Pennsylvania was suffering badly.
These facts were stated in loud, impassioned tones and with much vigorous gesturing. General Hooker was sitting on his horse so near the 27th that his voice could be easily heard without his speaking loud. Shells were whistling and screaming everywhere, and Minnie balls frequently found their way over to us, but he was as calm as if he had been resting in the shade bordering a harvest field.
When he found out what Knipe wanted, he turned and pointed to a regiment nearby and said, "There, General Knipe, take that one."
No, I don't want that one," Knipe fairly screamed, with long-drawn emphasis on the nose. In the meantime, he had not stopped, but had hurried by, still calling for General Williams.
Hooker called, "Here, General Knipe, General Knipe, Knipe, come here." But Knipe did not hear at first, or affected not to hear, and one of Hooker's staff started after him, calling him to come back.
Knipe finally turned and came back. Hooker this time pointed to the 27th and said, "Take that one." "All right," said Knipe, "I'll take that one," still speaking in high tones and drawing out his words. Then, coming up to the regiment as the men fell into ranks, he shrieked, "27th Indiana, I want you. This regiment has never been whipped, and it never will be whipped."
Later on, he passed in rear of the 27th while we were hotly engaged. He was still afoot and carrying his sword in his hand. He was also in his high state of excitement and was urging and encouraging the men with all his demonstrativeness and energy.
A sergeant of the 27th said in very bland tones, "General, have you any tobacco?" "Yes, I have some tobacco," the general replied in the same high-keyed tone.
And jabbing his sword in the ground, he produced from his breeches pocket a small piece of plug and handed it to the sergeant. The latter began turning it over and sizing it up, trying to decide whether or not there was too much of it for one good chew.
When the general saw what the sergeant was about, he said in a perfectly natural, though plaintive tone, with his strained, keyed-up condition entirely gone, "That's all I've got." Well, all the boys in hearing laughed heartily as the sergeant took out his knife, cut the tobacco in 2 parts, put one in his mouth, and handed the other back to the general, who thereupon pulled his sword out of the ground and went on his way. Sergeant Edmund R. Brown, 27th Indiana Infantry, Ruger's Brigade, Army of the Cumberland.
John Geary would write in his report, quote, "For 3 hours the fury of the battle along our entire line could not be surpassed. His command," he said, quote, "stood firm as a rock and mowed down column after column of that vast, struggling mass that charged them."
Geary had seen much of what he called, quote, "the stern realities of war," end quote. He'd been wounded at Cedar Mountain, had fought at Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Lookout Mountain, and Wauhatchie, where his 18-year-old son Edward had died in his arms. But for him, the fighting here on July 20th, 1864, outside Atlanta, would stand out. He reported, "It is with a feeling of unusual admiration for the troops under my command that I record the history of their part in the Battle of Peachtree Creek. I have never seen more heroic fighting."
In the end, the rebel attack on the Federal right was no more successful than their assaults on the Yankees' left and center. Geary and Williams, though they would suffer the greatest portion of the Union casualties that day, finally drove back the Confederate brigades attacking their lines.
Around 7 p.m., the firing sputtered out, and by 8, all was quiet, except for the pitiful moans of the dying and the desperate pleading of wounded men for water. An officer in an Indiana regiment wrote in a letter home, quote, "As twilight crept slowly over the scene, the hideous clamor of battle ceased, and a wondrous quiet took possession of the hillside. Men in low tones inquired of the wounded and spoke of the dead. In every heart was a strange conflict, exultation over the victory and grief for the fallen."
Those alive and unhurt were exhausted, their uniforms soaked through with sweat, their faces and hands stained from smoke and powder, and ears ringing from the roar of battle. One Federal sergeant recalled, "For 2 days our hearing was almost gone. It was several days before it was again normal."
Local legend would hold that Peachtree Creek ran red that day, and though this might not have been literally true, there's no question great quantities of blood had been spilled on both sides in the 3 hours of combat. The Federals had suffered about 1,900 casualties, while the Confederates lost around 2,500 dead, wounded, and missing.
For the Federals, we mentioned Geary's and Alpheus Williams' losses, but on each side, the casualties were unevenly distributed, especially among the attacking Confederates.
For example, the 4 brigades of Manny's division suffered only about 275 men killed and wounded, while 2 brigades in Loring's division, Featherston's and Scott's, suffered almost 5 times as many. Featherston's brigade alone suffered about 615 casualties, almost precisely half of the soldiers he'd taken into the fight. One regiment in the brigade, the 31st Mississippi, reported an appalling casualty rate of 76%. Of the 215 men who had made the charge against the Union center along Tanyard Creek, 164 had fallen.
An Illinois colonel wrote home, "I never have seen the dead rebels lie so thickly strewn upon the ground since the Battle of Shiloh." An Ohio lieutenant thought the battlefield, quote, "a harrowing, pitiful sight."
Burial details would scour the battlefield the next day, working quickly to inter bodies before the summer sun made the horrid work even worse than it was already. And so the dead were piled into mass graves, hastily dug and marked. one with a cracker box lid stuck upright that read simply, Colonel Drake, 33rd Mississippi, and 34 men.
Joel Murphy from Troy, Alabama, was a 37-year-old shopkeeper when he joined the Confederate Army in April 1864. He served as a quartermaster and cook. He delayed his enlistment at the request of his 9 brothers and brothers-in-law, who had volunteered earlier and asked him to remain at home to look after their families. In this letter to his wife, Ursula, he describes the death of Captain Bailey Talbot, a brother-in-law.
Dear Sulla, I wrote to you last Thursday from Atlanta, in which I had to chronicle the sad news of the death of Bailey. Letters miscarry sometimes, and for fear you have not received that letter, I write again. I dislike to communicate such heart-rending news, but I feel that it is my duty as a relative to do so. Brother James returned from the hospital yesterday, and he took down the names of 80 persons from the 57th Regiment that were killed, wounded, and missing, and a good many had been sent to other hospitals whose names he never got. There is a faint hope that Bailey had only been captured, perhaps wounded. No one knows positively that he was killed.
James questioned the wounded of his company, and he could learn nothing more than I wrote in my last letter concerning him, only that he acted imprudently in the charge. He was in advance of all the troops, in the face of the fire of the enemy from a battery and small arms, and in retreating was the last to leave the battery they had captured. Hence he was in the rear when they were ordered to fall back.
The charge was made through an open field, and of course had to retreat over the same ground. The last that was seen of him, he was coming through the field, had nearly reached safety. The soldier that saw him last says after walking a few steps, he looked back again, but could see nothing of him. He thinks he was wounded, which caused him to be so far in the rear. If Bailey acted prudently, he laid down, perhaps behind something that would protect him, and may yet be alive in the hands of the enemy. I am truly sorry for poor Millie. I have hardly thought of nothing else since the sad affair, but Bailey, Molly, and his other relatives.
Major Arnold was killed in trying to save Lieutenant Colonel Bethune, who was wounded severely. Major Arnold went to him and pulled him into a gully, and when he stepped out of the gully, was shot dead.
I learned that Henry Darby is missing. Joe Watley was slightly wounded, also William Motes. Lieutenant Colbert Wiley's wound is worse than I first learned. He is wounded in the leg severely. Those are the only persons of your acquaintance that I have heard of, though I expect there are others. Sergeant Joel D. Murphy, 57th Alabama Infantry, Scott's Brigade, Army of Tennessee.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is All the Fighting They Want, the Atlanta Campaign from Peachtree Creek to the City's Surrender, July 18th to September 2nd, 1864, by Stephen Davis.
This is another title in the Emerging Civil War series, and like the other books in this series, it's not just an easily accessible narrative of the campaign, but it's also a guide to points of interest on the battlefields and in the area.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and helping support the podcast in that way.
Thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope you'll join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.